When the Ottomans marched, victory did not always mean the sword. For some, death would have been mercy, because for the young men captured in their conquests, survival meant something far darker. They were not soldiers anymore. They were stripped of identity, stripped of dignity, and turned into something that made even warriors shudder: male concubines. And this was not random cruelty. It was systematized, ritualized, written into the very laws and institutions of the empire. A hidden world inside Ottoman palaces where men became property, their bodies weaponized for domination, their futures stolen. But what did this system look like? How did it transform free men into prisoners of flesh, bound to a fate worse than death itself? Before we uncover the full nightmare, hit subscribe so you don't miss our next descent into history's darkest shadows. Because what awaits in this story is not myth, not rumor, but cold fact carved into the empire's bureaucracy. Young captives torn from battlefields, noble sons paraded like spoils, inspected, measured, violated. Their strength was stripped away, their manhood stolen in ways too brutal to imagine. And those who survived this initiation were funneled into a life that was no life at all, a prison without walls, a cage wrapped in silk and gold. What the Ottomans did to their male concubines was not just exploitation, it was annihilation of identity. And the records reveal just how deep that cruelty ran. The story begins on the battlefield. When Ottoman armies triumphed, not every man who survived was allowed the dignity of chains. Some were selected, separated from the masses with cold precision. These weren't just prisoners of war, they were resources. Special officers, trained in the empire's methods, inspected young captives as livestock. Age, beauty, strength, all were tallied. The youngest and most striking were spared execution, not as an act of mercy, but for something far worse. They were marked for the palaces, their bodies destined to serve not with a sword, but with submission. The humiliation began instantly. Captured warriors, once proud defenders of their homes, were stripped in public. Ottoman physicians examined them like cattle, their muscles prodded, their bodies measured, their fertility judged. The process was not chaotic. It was organized cruelty. Every detail logged by scribes who turned human suffering into ledgers of profit and control. Then came the fate no man could escape: the mutilation. To ensure obedience and erase masculinity, many were castrated, a practice as brutal as it was efficient. Without anesthesia, without mercy, boys and young men were cut open by crude hands. Most did not survive. It is said that only 1 in 10 lived through the procedure. Those who did were forever broken, their voices warped, their bodies scarred, their futures erased. And yet, the empire considered this refinement. These survivors became eunuchs, the living tools of the sultan's will. Some were placed as guards over the sultan's harem, trusted to protect what they could never touch. Others were kept closer still, forced into the darkest role of all, concubines to the rulers themselves. This was not whispered scandal. It was institutionalized power, and the deeper you look, the more you see that for these men, survival was not a blessing. It was the cruelest punishment the empire could devise. Inside the Ottoman palaces, survival was no liberation. It was a new prison, one designed not only to control bodies, but to shatter souls. The eunuchs who lived were stripped of their pasts the moment they stepped through the palace gates. Their names were erased, their languages forbidden, their gods mocked. They were no longer men of their homeland. They were property of the Sultan, and property was catalogued with care. Imperial scribes kept meticulous records where each eunuch came from, his age at capture, his physical attributes. Ledgers piled high with details, turning human lives into entries of inventory. For the empire, this wasn't barbarism, it was administration. Cruelty disguised as order. The eunuchs were divided into strict hierarchies. Most were placed as servants, obeying the endless demands of palace officials. They scrubbed floors, carried messages, dressed nobles, and endured the constant reminder that they no longer belonged to themselves. But a select few, the youngest, the most striking, were pulled into another chamber of hell. They became concubines. Behind the gilded walls, the role of a male concubine was not whispered fantasy. It was degradation made law. They were forced into submission, paraded before high officials, and at times offered as gifts to secure loyalty. Their suffering became a currency of power, traded between men whose authority demanded not only obedience, but humiliation. And even within this nightmare, there was no escape through death. Suicide attempts were punished with spectacle. Those who tried to end their torment were dragged through palace courtyards, their broken bodies displayed as warnings. Survival was enforced as much as servitude. What makes this more chilling is how normalized it was. In Ottoman courts, eunuchs rose to positions of influence, but only because of their mutilation. Their loyalty was ensured by their brokenness. They became both tools and trophies, reminders of the empire's ability to take everything from a man, his future, his family, his very identity, and reshape him into something unrecognizable. And at the center of this system, humiliation was not a side effect. It was the purpose. At first glance, it might seem that the eunuchs who survived rose to prominence. Some commanded respect, wealth, even authority within the empire. The chief black eunuch, for example, stood among the most powerful men in the Ottoman court, controlling access to the Sultan himself. His voice could decide who lived, who died, who entered the Sultan's chambers, and who never saw the throne again. But this power was a mask, because beneath the titles and ceremonial robes, every step of their authority was chained to their mutilation. They were reminders of domination, not participants in it. Their every breath was owed to the empire that had destroyed them. Their rise was a paradox. The higher they climbed, the deeper their humiliation became. For these men, the torment was not only physical, it was psychological annihilation. Imagine a young boy taken from his family, stripped of his name, cut off from his faith, and forced to serve the very rulers who had slaughtered his people. His loyalty was demanded not by choice, but by the absence of alternatives. His manhood was gone, his lineage erased, his only survival tied to submission. The palace exploited this brokenness with brutal efficiency. Eunuchs were set against one another, competing for influence, vying for scraps of favor. Intrigue and betrayal became their daily existence. A mistake meant whipping, isolation, or execution. Success meant only more chains, gilded and polished, but chains nonetheless. Even their roles as guardians of the Sultan's harem twisted the knife deeper. They were surrounded by women they could never touch, wives and concubines they could never claim, yet forced to watch over them as protectors of the Sultan's pleasure. Every day was a living reminder of what had been taken from them, and for those marked as concubines themselves, the humiliation had no limit. Their bodies became symbols of submission. They existed not as men, not even as slaves, but as objects, tokens of the empire's absolute power over flesh. To the outside world, the eunuchs of the palace seemed powerful. To themselves, they were shadows, living reminders that survival under Ottoman rule was not victory. It was a sentence without end. Punishment was the empire's way of ensuring obedience. For the eunuchs, pain was constant, not only in memory of what had been taken from them, but in the daily reminders of the empire's control. Whippings were routine, carried out in courtyards before others to stamp fear into their hearts. Solitary confinement in lightless cells broke minds as effectively as blades broke bodies. Some punishments were theatrical. Eunuchs who disobeyed were paraded through the streets of Constantinople, their mutilated forms displayed for the crowd. Their humiliation became a performance, a warning carved into the minds of every onlooker. defy the empire, and become less than human. But control went further than physical torment. The Ottomans designed rituals to crush identity. A boy brought from the Balkans or Africa was forced to take a new name, one often mocking his origins. His native tongue was banned. He was beaten if he spoke the language of his ancestors. His gods were stripped away in forced conversions, not for salvation, but for domination. The shudder, whispered through broken lips, sealed his fate as a man erased. The empire weaponized this brokenness. Eunuchs became the hands of Ottoman power. They carried orders of execution, enforced the Sultan's commands, guarded treasures, and even managed the movement of armies within palace walls. But every task they carried out was another reminder. They were both tools and warnings. The paradox was chilling. A eunuch might oversee imperial ceremonies, command younger slaves, even speak with the Sultan himself. Yet in private, he lived as nothing more than a scarred shadow of what he once was. His survival was not life. It was a continuous exhibition of the empire's reach into flesh and spirit. Even in their rare authority, they could never escape. Because their very existence was designed to prove one thing: the Ottoman machine could break anyone. The Ottoman system did not keep its eunuchs hidden away. On the contrary, they became living propaganda. Their mutilated presence was a statement carried beyond palace walls to remind conquered lands of what awaited the defiant. In diplomatic missions, eunuchs often accompanied envoys. Dressed in fine robes, they stood silently beside ambassadors as symbols of the Sultan's reach. Their appearance alone unsettled foreign courts. Everyone who saw them understood. These men had been broken so completely that they now served as loyal instruments of the very power that destroyed them. In conquered cities, eunuchs enforced Ottoman law. Some acted as tax collectors, others as guards over markets and slave auctions. Their mere presence carried weight. Parents warned their children in hushed voices. Disobedience could mean the fate of becoming one of them. Fear traveled faster than armies, and eunuchs embodied that fear. But the empire's cruelty went even deeper. Eunuchs were used in religious displays meant to strip communities of hope. Converted by force, they were sometimes paraded into churches or mosques as proof of Ottoman dominance. Their mutilated voices reciting Islamic prayers sent a chilling message. Not only could the empire take your body, it could remake your soul. Even their deaths were exploited. A eunuch who failed the Sultan might be executed publicly, his body left hanging as a warning. Others were buried without names, erased from history except for the records kept by scribes. To the empire, their lives and deaths were numbers, tallies in the machinery of control. And yet their torment spread more than fear. It spread compliance. Cities surrendered not only to avoid cannon fire, but to avoid the fate their men might suffer if captured. Eunuchs became psychological weapons, living embodiments of submission, proof that resistance led not just to defeat, but to humiliation that outlived generations. In this way, the Ottomans perfected a cruelty that conquered minds as efficiently as it conquered territories. The Ottoman system did not keep its eunuchs hidden away. On the contrary, they became living propaganda. Their mutilated presence was a statement carried beyond palace walls to remind conquered lands of what awaited the defiant. In diplomatic missions, eunuchs often accompanied envoys. Dressed in fine robes, they stood silently beside ambassadors as symbols of the Sultan's reach. Their appearance alone unsettled foreign courts. Everyone who saw them understood these men had been broken so completely that they now served as loyal instruments of the very power that destroyed them. In conquered cities, eunuchs enforced Ottoman law. Some acted as tax collectors, others as guards over markets and slave auctions. Their mere presence carried weight. Parents warned their children in hushed voices. Disobedience could mean the fate of becoming one of them. Fear traveled faster than armies, and eunuchs embodied that fear. But the empire's cruelty went even deeper. Eunuchs were used in religious displays meant to strip communities of hope. Converted by force, they were sometimes paraded into churches or mosques as proof of Ottoman dominance. Their mutilated voices reciting Islamic prayers sent a chilling message. Not only could the empire take your body, it could remake your soul. Even their deaths were exploited. A eunuch who failed the sultan might be executed publicly, his body left hanging as a warning. Others were buried without names, erased from history except for the records kept by scribes. To the empire, their lives and deaths were numbers, tallies in the machinery of control. And yet their torment spread more than fear, it spread compliance. Cities surrendered not only to avoid cannon fire, but to avoid the fate their men might suffer if captured. Eunuchs became psychological weapons, living embodiments of submission, proof that resistance led not just to defeat, but to humiliation that outlived generations. In this way, the Ottomans perfected a cruelty that conquered minds as efficiently as it conquered territories. Inside the palace walls, life for a eunuch was not simply servitude, it was isolation sharpened into a weapon. They were cut off from the outside world, unable to form families, forbidden to claim children, and barred from true companionship. What little community they shared came from others like themselves, men mutilated and broken, each competing for scraps of favor in a system designed to pit them against one another. The palace hierarchy demanded rivalry. Eunuchs were ranked, measured by loyalty and usefulness. Promotions came rarely, but when they did, they were at the expense of another's downfall. Betrayal became survival, a whisper against a rival, a rumor planted, a slip reported to the wrong official. This was the currency of their existence. And with every act of sabotage, they fell further from the men they once were. Isolation drove many to madness. Some wandered the corridors at night, muttering in the languages of their youth, words beaten out of them in daylight but whispered in secret shadows. Others broke entirely, refusing to eat, staring blankly for days until their bodies gave up. Despair became routine. For those forced into roles as concubines, the psychological weight was unbearable. They were commanded to display obedience, to smile through humiliation, to feign acceptance of the fate forced upon them. Behind closed doors, their torment continued in silence. Tears were punished, resistance was crushed, and attempts to take their own lives were seen as defiance worthy of harsher suffering. Some clung to fragments of faith, quietly mouthing prayers in languages they had forgotten how to fully speak. But even that comfort was fragile. If caught, they faced beatings or worse. The empire wanted not only their bodies, but their minds, their souls, their entire sense of self. The result was a living death. They survived, but survival itself became another punishment. The greatest paradox of the Ottoman system was the illusion of power granted to its highest-ranking eunuchs. At the pinnacle stood the chief black eunuch, second only to the Grand Vizier in influence, and at times even more feared. He controlled access to the Sultan, managed the imperial harem, and oversaw vast networks of wealth and land. In the eyes of outsiders, he was untouchable, but this power was built on chains. His authority existed only because of his mutilation. His very role was proof of his brokenness. No matter how much he commanded, no matter how feared his word became, his body remained a living reminder that he was property, not man. The robes of honor he wore were nothing more than costumes covering scars, and the Sultan never let them forget it. Eunuchs lived in constant awareness that their fortunes could be destroyed in a moment. A single mistake, a whisper of disloyalty, even the Sultan's shifting moods could see them stripped of their robes and thrown into darkness. Power that seemed absolute was always conditional. This dependence on humiliation shaped their entire existence. The chief eunuch might command armies of servants, yet he could not marry. He might sign orders that moved nations, yet he could not sire a son to carry his name. His authority was vast, but his legacy was nothing. He died as he lived, an instrument of someone else's will. For the lower ranks, this paradox was even sharper. A eunuch could rise through the system, accumulating wealth, houses, even slaves of his own. But all of it was temporary, all of it fragile, because his status was built on the very thing that stripped him of identity. In Ottoman eyes, he was never free, never whole, never more than a shadow given shape. Even in the height of their influence, eunuchs embodied the empire's cruel genius, breaking men so thoroughly that their power itself became another form of punishment. For centuries, the suffering of these men was silenced. Ottoman chronicles recorded their existence, but only as ledgers of service, numbers, duties, transactions. Their humanity was buried under ink and bureaucracy. Historians marveled at the empire's grandeur, its architecture, its conquests. Few stopped to ask what it meant that entire generations of men had been mutilated, enslaved, and erased from memory. The silence was intentional. To acknowledge their torment would be to admit the brutality at the heart of Ottoman power. Instead, eunuchs were woven into myths. They were portrayed as loyal guardians of the harem, faithful servants of the sultan, mysterious figures shrouded in exotic secrecy. The truth, the blood, the mutilation, the humiliation was pushed into the shadows. But their absence left scars in the lands from which they were taken. Villages lost their sons, noble houses lost their heirs, families vanished with no line to continue them. Communities whispered of boys taken by force, never seen again, returned only in stories too dark to speak aloud. Mothers mourned children who were not killed, but whose survival meant something worse than death. And the legacy endured. The fear of capture lingered for generations across the Balkans, the Middle East, and Africa. Parents used it as warning. Disobedience could mean chains, humiliation, mutilation. This collective memory shaped cultures, built walls of mistrust, and left wounds that never healed. Even survivors who rose to prominence carried torment within them. They spoke Ottoman Turkish instead of their native tongue, worshipped under duress, and died far from the lands that once called them sons. They were foreigners everywhere, rejected by their homelands, distrusted within the empire, and remembered in history not as men, but as shadows. This was the deepest cruelty of all. The Ottomans ensured their victims did not simply suffer in life. They suffered in memory, erased as individuals, remembered only as proof of empire. The deepest horrors came not from survival, but from the spectacle of survival. The Ottomans perfected cruelty as theater, and eunuchs were often its unwilling actors. Some were forced into public parades, their mutilated bodies displayed in chains before crowds. These men were not merely punished, they were transformed into living warnings. A broken voice, a scarred face, a body robbed of its manhood, all became banners of Ottoman domination. Each step they took down the streets of Constantinople declared to the world, resistance is futile. Even survival will destroy you. Others were subjected to punishments designed purely for humiliation. A rebellious eunuch might be locked in an iron cage, suspended above a marketplace, left to starve while passers-by threw insults or rotten food. The slow wasting of his body was not a private torment, but a public show of power. His death became a sermon to every witness. There were darker spectacles still. Eunuchs were sometimes forced to fight one another for the amusement of soldiers and nobles. These fights were not contests of skill, but gladiatorial humiliation. Men already broken were pushed to break each other, clawing for survival in a ring where the only prize was more pain. Even their voices were weaponized. Eunuchs with warped throats were made to sing at feasts, their strained falsettos turned into grotesque entertainment. What was once agony became music for Ottoman elites, another reminder that human suffering could be molded into performance. For the empire, this cruelty had a purpose beyond punishment. It spread fear across borders. Travelers and captives carried tales of mutilated men forced to march, fight, or sing. Entire cities surrendered not to the cannon, but to the whisper of what awaited their sons if they resisted. This was the climax of Ottoman control, turning broken men into symbols, their suffering repurposed as entertainment, their very existence reshaped into the empire's strongest weapon, fear. The physical mutilation of the eunuchs was only the beginning. The Ottomans understood that true power came not from cutting flesh, but from erasing identity. What followed was psychological destruction so complete that many survivors lived as hollow shells, strangers even to themselves. The first stage was renaming. A boy taken from Hungary or Ethiopia might carry a proud family name tied to generations of warriors or farmers. The moment he entered the palace, that name was stripped away. He was assigned a new one in Ottoman Turkish or Arabic, often mocking, often generic. His old name was never spoken again. Scribes recorded him under this new title, and with a stroke of ink, his past ceased to exist. Language was the next weapon. Speaking his mother tongue was forbidden. If caught, he was beaten, sometimes starved. Over time, the boy forgot the words of his childhood. When he tried to recall them, only fragments remained, shattered sounds that no longer carried meaning. By adulthood, many eunuchs could not pray in the language of their ancestors or whisper the names of their parents. Their memories became prisons. Faith, too, was twisted into control. Forced conversions to Islam were not ceremonies of devotion, but acts of domination. Eunuchs were made to recite prayers before jeering guards, beaten if their voices faltered. Refusal meant torture. Acceptance meant the final cutting of ties with their past communities. Many no longer knew where they belonged. To their homelands, they were traitors. To the empire, they were property. The empire weaponized this dislocation. By erasing their roots, it ensured they could never return home. A eunuch released or retired would find no welcome in the land of his birth. Families often rejected them as tainted, cursed, or no longer recognizable. Some wandered in silence, unable to speak their old tongue, unable to kneel in their old churches, carrying scars that made them outcasts. This was the cruel genius of the system. The body could heal, even from mutilation. But when you severed a man from his past, his family, his gods, his very language, you destroyed him in ways no blade could. What remained was a hollow figure, existing only to serve the empire that had broken him. Some resisted in small ways, scribbling secret prayers, humming forbidden songs, teaching each other scraps of their lost languages in whispers. But the empire crushed even these sparks. Informants were everywhere. Rival eunuchs reported one another to climb the hierarchy. Punishments were brutal, swift, and public. By the end, many eunuchs no longer fought for survival. They simply endured. They became walking reminders of what it meant to defy the Ottomans. Not men, not slaves, not even prisoners, just shadows. Erased from their past, denied a future, they existed in a present that was nothing but obedience. This was the final stage of destruction. To kill a man was simple. To mutilate him was cruel. But to erase his identity so completely that he could not even mourn what he had lost, that was worse than death. The empire's cruelty did not stop with the men it mutilated. The eunuchs became symbols, their suffering exported into every corner of Ottoman territory. Fear spread faster than any army, and it lingered long after the battles ended. In the Balkans, parents whispered warnings to their children. Stay quiet, obey, or the Ottomans will take you. These weren't empty threats. Entire villages had watched boys ripped from their homes, marched away in chains, only to return years later unrecognizable. Voices high, bodies scarred, eyes hollow. Some never returned at all. Their absence was its own kind of wound, leaving families with empty seats at their tables, dynasties with no heirs, and communities that dwindled with every raid. Generations lived under this shadow. The threat of becoming a eunuch was enough to break resistance before it began. A father might surrender his city not to save his own life, but to spare his sons from mutilation. In this way, the Ottomans turned individual suffering into collective control. The eunuchs became a weapon sharper than any sword, proof that survival could be worse than death. The psychological scars outlived the empire itself. In regions once under Ottoman control, stories of the eunuchs survived as folklore, whispered with the same dread as tales of monsters. Mothers frightened their children into obedience with the memory of the castrators. Elders spoke of neighbors who had been taken, their fates never spoken of directly, but always understood. And the impact was not only cultural, it was demographic. The systematic removal and mutilation of men left deep imbalances in conquered lands. Villages without young men struggled to rebuild. Families collapsed without heirs. Nobility lost its lines of inheritance, its traditions shattered. Eunuchs did not just serve the empire, they erased futures. Meanwhile, within the empire, their presence reshaped politics. The chief black eunuch became one of the most influential figures in Constantinople, a man feared more than many generals. His very existence was a reminder that broken men could wield immense authority, but only as tools of the Sultan. His power was never his own. It was a reflection of the empire's cruelty, a mirror held up to show what conquest could achieve. This paradox fascinated foreign observers. European travelers wrote in shock about eunuchs who commanded armies of servants, yet could never bear children. They marveled at their wealth, while shuddering at their mutilation. To outsiders, the Ottoman use of eunuchs became proof of an empire that could turn even human suffering into machinery for rule. And that machinery left marks that endured for centuries. The eunuchs were not just a system of control in their own time. They became scars etched into the memory of entire regions. Their silence echoed long after they were gone, a reminder that conquest did not end with swords and cannons. It lived on in bodies broken, names erased, generations lost. This was conquest by mutilation, and its shadow still lingers in the histories of those who lived beneath the empire's reach. By now it's clear, the Ottoman use of eunuchs was not random cruelty. It was deliberate, codified, and sustained for centuries, and that's what makes it more terrifying. This was not chaos, it was order, a system built not only to dominate men, but to annihilate the very idea of resistance. Every detail was planned. The inspections on the battlefield, the physicians who decided which boys lived or died, the scribes who recorded their new names, the officers who transported them across the empire, all of it was part of a machine. It was conquest written into flesh, maintained by law, and celebrated as civilization. The message was simple and devastating. No one was safe. Nobles lost their sons, warriors lost their brothers, villages lost their futures, and those who survived did so as walking warnings. A eunuch in the palace was not merely a servant. He was living proof of what the empire could do to you if you resisted. The Ottomans understood that domination was most effective when it left scars that outlived victory. A city could be rebuilt after it fell to cannon fire. A wall could be repaired, but a generation of mutilated men? That wound did not heal. It lingered in the bodies of survivors, in the whispers of families, in the fear of children who grew up under the shadow of the empire's cruelty. And the records remain. Ottoman archives preserve thousands of documents listing eunuchs by name, by age, by price. Ledgers of misery that turned men into statistics, identities into inventory. Each page is a reminder that these were not myths or rumors, they were facts written in ink. What makes it worse is how often history ignored them. For centuries, scholars praised Ottoman administration, its architecture, its cultural achievements. But buried beneath those praises lay the silent agony of the eunuchs, erased from narrative just as they had been erased from their homelands. Only in recent decades has the true scale begun to surface, drawn from the very archives that once buried their suffering. The lesson is chilling. When empire is willing to mutilate men, erase their names, strip their faith, and turn their torment into policy, it proves that conquest is not about land. It is about people. It is about ensuring that even survival feels like defeat. For the eunuchs, death might have been an end, but the Ottomans denied them even that. They lived as proof of the empire's cruelty, shadows trapped in flesh, condemned to carry their suffering until their final breath. This was the Ottoman machine at its darkest, not just conquering bodies, but conquering identity, memory, and humanity itself. And so we return to the question, what did the Ottomans do to their male concubines? The answer is not just mutilation, not just enslavement, not just humiliation. It was all of these, fused into a system where survival itself became punishment. The eunuchs were more than victims. They were symbols, living proof that the empire could unmake a man, erase his name, strip his faith, and turn his body into both tool and warning. To their captors, they were useful. To their homelands, they were lost. To themselves, they were shadows, trapped in lives that belonged neither to past nor future. The cruelty of the system was not in its chaos, but in its efficiency. Every scar, every broken voice, every nameless grave was evidence of a bureaucracy that turned suffering into order. The eunuchs were not accidents of conquest. They were policies, sanctioned by judges, recorded by scribes, and celebrated as civilization. And yet, their story almost vanished. For centuries, the eunuchs of the Ottoman Empire were remembered only as exotic curiosities, guardians of harems, mysterious figures in palace corridors. Their pain was hidden beneath myth, their humanity buried under silence. Only now, with deeper study of the archives, do we begin to glimpse the true cost. What remains is haunting. Families destroyed, villages emptied, generations scarred by the threat of mutilation. Men who lived, but who no longer had lives. Their voices may be gone, but their suffering speaks through the records, through the scars etched into history itself. The empire's walls have crumbled, its palaces stand as museums, but the shadows of the eunuchs still linger. They are reminders that conquest is not only about battles won or borders drawn. It is about the destruction of people, the breaking of bodies, the erasure of identity. And that destruction echoes across centuries. Perhaps the darkest truth is this. For many of these men, death would have been mercy. But the Ottomans denied them even that. They were forced to live as monuments of pain, testaments to an empire that understood the most terrifying weapon was not the sword, but the ability to turn survival into something worse than death. And that is why their story matters. Not because of how they lived, but because of how completely they were erased, and how easily history itself tried to erase them again. If you've stayed with me through this descent into one of history's darkest corners, remember, these stories are not just relics of the past. They are warnings about the cruelty that power can inflict when left unchecked. So, if you want more stories that pull back the curtain on the shadows of history, don't forget to like this video, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. What do you think? Was survival for these men truly worse than death? We'll see you in the next one.